Ludum Dare was last weekend, and it seems as though I couldn't wait to overscope a new game and race against the clock to create something in one weekend that really shouldn't be done in one weekend. But by the time it was over, I ended up with a game and I'm surprised I actually managed to finish. Howdy, and welcome to Game Endeavor, where I post devlogs with an emphasis on game design and technique. Last weekend, I participated in Ludum Dare, where I created a game in 72 hours, everything from the code, art, music, and UI. It's a stressful event that can teach you a lot about how to develop a game, refine your skills at design, and teach you a lesson about managing your scope. Typically in a game jam, it is well advised to create something that is simple and easy to make. And I think this time I just did not care, and literally tried to create the most complex game that I've ever attempted in one weekend. It required a lot of art and code, and by the end I was pretty tired and glad it was over. But I finished the jam and I was actually pretty surprised at what I was able to create, but please, future me, never do this again. I will. The theme for the jam was unstable, much like my state of mind right now, which Ludum Dare themes are always pretty terrible. Wait, hold on, what? The theme was actually pretty good. There's a lot you can do with this, and it's probably one of my personal favorites that I've ever done with Ludum Dare. As usual, I started out by brainstorming the theme with my Discord community, and we had so many great ideas. My favorites were the game where you need to herd horses out of a burning stable. You took a shopping cart with a bad wheel and need to steer it without crashing into other customers. Or you're a tightrope walker and pigeons keep landing on your balancing pole, making it difficult. We had so many great ideas that I actually had a hard time picking just one to work with. However, I decided to go with you playing as a summoned monster whose ritual was interrupted, thus causing your powers to be unstable. I explain it in the intro cutscene in the game. I won't spoil it for you here, but it's so good. After brainstorming, I needed to quickly create a prototype that featured the core gameplay and nothing else. This is my favorite part of game development, where the only thing I work with is the code of the project. I keep everything simple, using only basic shapes and crude code that's simply to get an idea down. You have to work quickly because at this point you don't even know if you're going to like your game. My first prototype was not the one that I actually ended up using. I started out with the idea of you playing as a pilot that's controlling a little spaceship. The spaceship would have a massive cannon strapped to it which would violently shake your ship and cause damage over time. However, just before going to bed, I decided to write down one more idea. And it was one that I had of a group of dark mages right before being attacked. They would summon a creature to help them defend themselves, but the ritual goes wrong and the summon would become unstable. I loved this idea. The next day when I woke up, I decided to scrap the work I had done the previous night and go with this new project instead. And this is when the overscoping began. The idea here was that the ritual binding the creature to this realm would be unstable. Their powers would fluctuate and change periodically. If not for this, then they would be an immensely powerful creature of apocalyptic caliber. But now, they're unable to use their full power, and the player would need to control this creature, dealing with their chaotic abilities. So I started out by prototyping the player controller. The core of this game was going to be on this mechanic, so I knew that I was going to need to put a lot of attention into the player at first. Typically, I will implement a basic player controller and then focus more on the enemies because to me, the enemies are what makes the game fun. With the player controller, my main focus was on controlling the monster, so the first ability I added was the dashing ability. I had this idea of a monster that is just powerful, fast, and ferocious. Having to control a creature that lunges at its target seemed like it would be really satisfying. After I added the other abilities though, this added to the chaotic nature of the main mechanic, because you would be attacking with more traditional attacks 1 minute, and then suddenly charging off at the other enemies with full force. I needed to be able to switch these abilities randomly to complete the main mechanic for the game. To do this, I'm storing references in an array and starting a timer. Once that timer runs out, it will then shuffle the array, take a random ability, and then swap that with the current one, making sure that the player doesn't already have this ability. Originally, I wasn't going to have different sprites for each ability. The player was going to have one sprite, the vampire-looking one, and then I would play an animation whenever their ability changed. However, when developing the game, I felt confused about which ability my character had at the time, and towards the end of the jam, I decided that the best way to show this was to have a unique character for each ability. With Ludum Dare, you're allowed to bring in some base code, the kind of code that you would reuse in your projects. Thank goodness too, because there's only so many times that I can create a state machine from scratch. One of my favorite things to bring in is the context-based steering code that I use for AI movement. This saved me a lot of time because in just a few lines of code, I was able to get enemies moving towards the player when they're within range. With the basic enemy implemented, I had the foundation for gameplay, so I needed to start creating the rest of the game, such as the level transitions and the UI. I probably spent a good couple of hours just on UI, and the title screen is literally a black screen that just says "a game" for most of development. The room transition wasn't too bad, but it still involves a bit of UI work. Something that I really like in a game jam is when they show you how much of a level is left, so you know how long it will take to complete. I prefer short and sweet games that get to the point, so I created a screen that displayed the amount of rooms that were left, which ones you had completed, and which one was currently active. I'm not gonna lie, at this point in development, I was even considering having several different rooms with branching paths that the player could take. There is so much overscope that got cut from this game, because silly me gets a little overconfident in my abilities. By the end of the first day, I actually had all of the important elements implemented, which really surprised me. This was by far the quickest that I had ever worked on in a game jam. Feeling quite proud of myself, I went to bed that night dreading the next day because that's when the real work would begin. Coding is my favorite part of game development. It's the thing that I love the most, I have the most experience in, and something that I can do relatively quickly. But art and music, they take so much longer to do. And this is usually where my progress in a game jam starts to take a hit. I started by working on the wall tiles. At this point, I had been developing the game using a 16 by 16 grid size. If you're familiar with me and my content, then you know what's about to happen next. I quickly changed to working with a 24 by 24 tile set because it just wasn't working out for me. After that, I created the floors that would go with the tiles. I wasn't exactly sure what texture I wanted to use for this. I started out trying to do some tiles that would be broken up with dirt patches, but I didn't really like how this looked. Eventually, I just went with dirt floors because the brown would contrast the gray walls much better, and because I prefer drawing fluffy things, like this roof I drew recently for my main project, which, by the way, I created a Kickstarter page for, but more on that later. I also knew at this point that it was quite possible that I wouldn't have the time to decorate the levels. The different colors would also add variety to the look of the area. The walls and floors looked great, but I needed to work on some character sprites. While I personally wouldn't mind just having everyone be ambiguous little squares, most people come to expect at least some effort to the character art. I started with the player, which I knew was going to be some fearsome creature. I was actually a little concerned at this point. Player art always takes me the longest to create because the player needs to stand out and look the best. And I knew I was going to be creating this guy somewhat large, which means a longer time to create and polish. I started out by creating a silhouette. My goal was to create some kind of dark mage looking beast that would be ferocious, but potentially very intelligent. However, since the ritual that summoned him to our world was interrupted, I also wanted him to be a little silly as well. Once I have the silhouette, I know that the character looks interesting and recognizable. I start finding the shapes that are going to define the character inside of the silhouette. I was going to animate him levitating, having his robes move around a bit, add a little more scope, but I quickly gave up on this idea and just tweened his animation instead. To contrast the gigantic player sprite, I decided to make the little knight characters as tiny as I could reasonably get away with, and I absolutely love how adorable they came out. I may have to reuse these little guys in one of my main projects. I didn't want to make a sword fighting character again, as that's something that I do very often, so I made them as archers that fire arrows at you. I made another variant of them which threw bombs that you would have to avoid. My favorite part of working with these was the particle effects for the bombs. I actually learned a neat little trick that I'll be using for my future projects. One of the issues that I often have with particles is changing their color. Fire particles in particular. If you try to adjust their color using a gradient, then you end up with this gross looking mess. It's just awful. I just duplicated the colors that I was using and pushed them just before they were to change their color. The result of this is something that looks so much better, adheres to the palette, and maintains that retro aesthetic without looking too modern. It still does look somewhat modern because it's particles, but it doesn't look terribly out of place for a pixel art game. Once I had the art for the game, I submitted it to Itch and took a well-deserved break. I love game jams, but they sure do like to turn an otherwise relaxing weekend into a chaotic, stressful event. I created a Kickstarter page for my main project. If you like this video and want to take a look at that, it's an action-adventure game where you explore a sprawling open world and solve various mini-epic quests, not to be confused with mini-quest. I'll be launching it sometime next year. There's a link in the description where you can take a look, as well as a card in the corner where you can watch the first devlog. Thank you patrons for supporting this content, and I'll talk to you next time.